at Washington State University. His dissertation work centered on physiology and behavior of fairy wrens, a colorful and socially complex family of birds native to Australia and New Guinea. And by the way, the distance between Australia and New Guinea is only 1,500 miles. It's a little closer. During extensive field seasons in New Guinea, he learned the indigenous people harbor immense knowledge of local fauna and is now working with local communities to study and conserve rare and potentially imperiled species as a postdoctoral researcher at Cornell Lab of Ornithology. He has written over 20 publications, and if you have a chance to look at his website and his YouTube channel, you might enjoy some videos of his work. Please welcome Dr. Boersma.
All right, thanks, David. So I'll be wandering around during my talk, so just let me know if I'm outside of the Zoom universe. I want to make sure that everyone can see me, but I think I'll start over here. So before I dive into telling this story of looking for this one particularly rare species in New Guinea, I just wanted to ask who in here has heard about the black-naped pheasant-pigeon before? Okay, one hand. Okay, great. So that means I can start from square one. So this is a species that wasn't very well known. There are probably very few people, mostly just ornithologists, who knew about this species until very recently, but now it's become quite a well-known species since we've returned from this trip. But before talking about this especially elusive species that we went to look for in New Guinea, I'm going to talk just briefly about how I got to this particular project, and it starts from studying some really common species in Australia and New Guinea, which David mentioned. Fairy wrens, which probably a lot of you haven't heard about before. Maybe some of you have. There have been a number of folks before me at the Lab of Ornithology who have studied fairy wrens because they are, these really elaborately plumed birds that are quite common in Australia, especially. They're like backyard birds. They're much like the wrens that we have here. But unlike our wrens, which tend to be really drab and brown, the males of these species tend to be extremely colorful. And when you see them flying through their savanna habitat, it's like these jewels that are just, glimmering in the sunlight. So there are a lot of reasons why we study these birds. I won't be talking about them much today, though this is still the bulk of my research is studying fairy wrens. But among the projects that we work on in these species is trying to understand what makes them so colorful and why they become so colorful, and also trying to understand things about their behavior, particularly what causes some of them to cooperate, so to help their parents at nests and forego breeding, and some to become colorful really early in life and start breeding at a young age. So there are a lot of interesting topics that we delve into with fairy wrens, but one thing I like to tell people about with fairy wrens that makes them particularly special is that they're the only bird that I know of that carries flower petals to their mates. And so here's a video of, it's going to be two different red-backed fairy wrens. It can be hard to see, but once this comes into focus, what you're going to look for is the first one has a pinkish red flower petal, and then the second one will have a small yellow flower petal. So the males will fly around and carry flower petals to females, which is what you're going to see here, if the video will play. All right, I'll have to go over to my computer. Okay, so because they're so tiny, it can be hard to see. Where is my cursor? I'm trying to get my cursor over to my computer and it's not. Oh, there we go. So can you see this small flower petal? Yeah, that one has a yellow flower petal. So they often carry flower petals that match their really colorful plumage. And, because we're on the sort of the eve of Valentine's Day, you might think like, well, this is great. They're just like us. They carry flower petals to to their wives, because like most birds, they are socially monogamous. They tend to mate for life. However, what we found is that flower petal carrying is almost exclusively to neighboring females, not to their own mates. So they've I think determined that, all right, I've already successfully attracted this female, so I'll put in a little bit of extra effort to see if I can charm neighboring females so I can spread my genes across the population. So they are a little bit devious, but they're great little birds. And so I initially was studying fairy wrens in Australia, including, well, mostly that redback fairy wren I just showed you. And there's a closely related species called the white-shouldered fairy wren that's found only in New Guinea. And I had the opportunity to go study that for my dissertation work. So I won't be talking about that today, about the topics that I was delving into for my dissertation. But the gist of it was that in this species, it's particularly unusual that the females vary in how colorful they are. So there are parts of their range where the females are kind of drab and brown, like what we normally see in fairy wrens, and other parts where they have this contrasting black and white plumage, a lot like the males, which makes them stick out in their grassland habitat. And so that was the basis of the work that we were doing there. Again, these are really common species, which makes them ideal for doing long-term, really intensive physiological and behavioral work. And so while I was in New Guinea, as incredible as New Guinea is for birds, I was really just fixating in this one really common species. However, I was, of course, interested in the other birds that were around and did some birding while I was there, and started to have some ideas of where I might want to go in the future, which is what I'll be talking about today. Before I get there, I just want to show what it looks like to work in New Guinea. It really is one of the really final frontiers for biological exploration. It's a really rugged place with incredible forests and waterfalls. The reefs are unbelievable. This is just a photo I took just snorkeling right off of one of my field sites when we would take breaks during the heat of the day. And we'd work in these often pretty remote villages where the houses were still made of bush materials, and it's a really different way of life that we got to experience while we were there. And it was really some foundational experiences for me. The bottom right photo of skulls is from a skull cave near one of my field sites, which are unique to a couple parts in New Guinea for preserving people in the village. But as much as I went there to have these incredible nature experiences and adventures, and to get off the grid, really what stuck with me after my first field season was just how incredible the local people are. The hospitality in New Guinea is beyond anywhere else that I've worked. But also the aptitude for indigenous people to conduct scientific studies was truly remarkable. So in my first field season in 2015, I spent 5 months in New Guinea, and it really felt by the end of that time that I had these extended families that I was lucky to keep coming back to over the course of my dissertation work there. And I was planning to mostly work with local people to conduct my research over the course of a number of years, and thought that it would take some time to train people who don't have prior exposure to this kind of research to help with field studies. But the reality was that they already had all the skills and more that I had, and it was quite straightforward process to get everyone trained up to help with these projects. And so I was really struck just by how immense the local knowledge was for birds in particular, but just generally for nature. And in 2015, during that first dissertation field season, I was working in a village that was on the north coast of Milne Bay province, which is in southeastern New Guinea. I was looking out at these islands called the D'Entrecasteaux Archipelago. They're these rugged mountainous islands. And my brother was coming to visit me from Malaysia, where he was living at the time. And he's a geologist. And so I was thinking, well, where could I take him that would be interesting to him? Because he's not really interested in birds, which is usually what draws people to New Guinea. And my local friends were telling me, well, you should go to Ferguson Island because it has this incredible geothermal activity. It's kind of like a mini Yellowstone. There are these prismatic pools and really incredible geysers that you can just walk right up to. And there are no other tourists there. It's a very intimate experience of basically Yellowstone. So that's what drew us to Ferguson Island. We had about a week there where we were really focused on the geologic sites because I was just trying to keep my brother entertained. But of course, I wanted to see the birds that were special to that island. And the main one is this Goldie's bird of paradise, which is known only from Ferguson and neighboring Normanby Island. And so while we were walking around looking at geologic sites, I would ask the local people in these areas who were, guiding us to craters and geysers and prismatic pools if they knew the Goldie's bird of paradise, if they had any display sites on their land, so places where males were performing dances for females, where we could get a really good look at this unique species. And time again, when I pulled up that page in my field guide and asked about the Goldie's bird of paradise, people would point to this species, the blue bird of paradise, which is one of the more iconic birds of paradise in the world that draws people from all over the world to Papua New Guinea. They would point to this bird and they'd say, well, we have something that's similar to this, but its tail is a little bit different. And I would page to the field guide and we never found anything that really matched. And so as crazy as it seems now and seemed at the time, because of course, as a scientist, I'm trained to be very skeptical. But at this point, I had spent so many months in New Guinea, and what I had learned is that local people had really impressive knowledge of what was in their forest. And so the fact that we couldn't find any species in our field guide that seemed to match this bird that they were describing, maybe start to wonder if there could be a new bird of paradise lurking on this island. One thing I want to say is that this species, the bluebird of paradise, is not known from anywhere close to Ferguson Island. It's only known from high mountains on the mainland. So we wouldn't expect there to be a population of this particular bird. The fact that people were telling us we have something like this, but the tail is different, that made me think that, oh, maybe there is a new species that's lurking in the mountains on this island. So as we traveled around, again, mostly just looking at the geology, I would just pull out my field guide everywhere we came to, and was quickly surrounded by a lot of people, and would try not to point directly to that bird just to see if people independently shared the same experience. And I heard that, I think, 3 or 4 times. And so this was a thought that was in the back of my head as I conducted my dissertation work from 2015 to 2019. Could there be this new undescribed species lurking on Ferguson Island? So at the end of my dissertation work in 2019, I carved out 3 weeks to go back to Ferguson to try to retrace my steps, find the same people who told me that they had this special bird that they had seen in the mountains. Unfortunately, back in 2015, it was my first field season as a graduate student. I wasn't really taking the best notes. And also, at the time that I was visiting Ferguson, I was just a tourist, and I wasn't really there for the birds. And this, in 2015, I wasn't thinking this was going to be the birth of a project. I was just there to see some sights. So it was hard for me to retrace my steps. I learned a lot of lessons from this, and figure out who I talked to and where that was. And so as we were traveling around, I did the same thing I remember doing in 2015, and I didn't find the same stories that I found back then. So eventually, we just gave up on finding those same people that I talked to before, and we just made a plan to go into the mountains to just see what we could find. And this is what it looked like where we camped in the mountains of Ferguson Island. So we stayed up here for about 2 weeks, and we were in the clouds pretty much the whole time. It was really miserable. Not only was it miserable just to be up there in these conditions because you're just cold and wet all the time, but the birds were really quiet, and there weren't that many around because the conditions weren't great. However, we still had a great adventure. I'd never done an expedition like this before. And we learned a lot, including that these giant beetle grubs were actually relatively delicious. They kind of taste like crayfish if you fry them up. And so, one thing that I've learned from doing work like this now is, if you're planning for a couple weeks in the forest like this, you can really only bring enough food to just kind of meet your needs. And so anything else is just a bonus. And so you become, not you lose any pickiness you might have for food. And so any additional protein and fat is a good thing. It doesn't matter where it comes from. So anyway, we had this, incredible adventure up on this mountain. We were miserable a lot of the time, but it was, good type 2 fun. It wasn't fun in the moment, but it was fun to recall, including, it's fun to recall now. And as you can see in this photo on the left, there were times where we did smile. However, we did not come across this bird that I, had in the back of my head from 2015. But there are a couple of things that were really successful with this trip. So one is I think I solved the mystery of this bird that the locals were talking about back in 2015. So this is the curl-crested monocote. It's a bird of paradise, despite being, it really just kind of looks like a crow in this photo. And this is what it looks like most of the time when you see it. It really just looks like a crow. But however, there was one time on this expedition in 2019 where I was up at the highest elevation that we had cut a trail to. I should say that this mountain had never been surveyed by any biologist before, and the locals told us that no one in that village had ever gone up to that elevation on that mountain before. So it was, truly virgin terrain. So, it was exciting to be there, and we really did think that we had a chance to find something new. Anyway, so at the top of where we had cut this trail, I was alone one morning, and the clouds finally broke for about 30 seconds. That's about as long as they would ever break during that trip, unfortunately. And when that happened, I saw this bird moving around in the stunted canopy up there, and I turned to it, and I saw these brilliant blue wings, and I thought, there was a split second where I thought, wow, this is going to be the career-defining moment for me. This is the bird that I'm after. And then, that split second passed, and I realized it's just the curl-crested monocote. And I've never seen it in full sunlight before. It's rare to see them in full sunlight. And when you do, their wings have this iridescent, glossy blue color to them. And so when the sun hit this bird, especially because it was in the stunted canopy, it was really glowing blue, like a blue bird of paradise. And so in retrospect, I think this is what happened. I failed to appreciate that these two birds could be confused with each other because I hadn't had that kind of experience with the monocote before. Again, the good thing is that I learned lessons from this experience, and it informed how we approach things on our most recent trip. All right, so following that initial expedition in 2019, we published this small paper where we were just sharing all of the species that we came across while we were on this trip. And as it turns out, we came across a number of species that weren't known to this island before. It is quite a big island, and it's part of this archipelago that forms an endemic bird area, which means that it's characterized by a high level of species that are unique to that area. So it's a place that's of conservation concern, and has been visited by several pretty major ornithologists. Jared Diamond has been there a number of times. So there has been other effort to characterize the birds on this island, and even with just a short trip like this, we came across a number of species that weren't known from there, including this species called the torrent fly robin, which hadn't been documented for the entire archipelago before. So what that told us is that there's still a lot of work we need to do to characterize the biodiversity on this island. My field assistant at the time, who's now my collaborator on the project I'm focusing on today, Jason Gregg, he had brought along a new field guide that showed this species called the Black-naped Pheasant-pigeon as a unique species to Ferguson Island. So my field guide just had one species that was just pheasant pigeon with multiple subspecies, but there was a recent taxonomic split that was shown in Jason's field guide. And so what we gleaned on this trip was that based on that record for black-naped pheasant pigeon, it was clear that there was basically nothing known scientifically about this bird. And so we started to ask locals about this species and, heard some reports that encouraged us that, maybe it's still around, and we knew that this was something that was of conservation concern. Fortunately, Jason had the forethought to then write about it in this paper that we didn't come across the species because we looked it up and it was, at this point, an IUCN listed endangered species. But when we got back from our trip, we learned that it had actually been a very, very long time since it had been formally documented. So this man named Andrew Goldie, who is the one who named that Goldie's bird of paradise, that was the main bird I wanted to see there. He also, back in 1882, shot 2 black-naped pheasant pigeons. So these are the original 2 specimens that were collected in the top right. Ooh, I lost my brackets here, that's all right. So what I meant to highlight is this one paragraph. For those of you on Zoom, it's just the fourth up from the third up from the bottom, is really the only paragraph that describes the black-naped pheasant pigeon at all. So, or describes where he shot this species. So he describes that it was shot on, or this pair was shot on an exceedingly rough range at an altitude of over 2,000 feet on Ferguson Island. So for reference, over 2,000 feet, this map is in meters, is anything from red to white on this map. So there's a lot of terrain. Again, this island is about the size of Kauai, so it's a relatively large island. And so that's all we kind of had to go off of to try to figure out where this species was initially collected. So this is all that's published scientifically about this species. There is one more specimen that I've now seen at the American Museum of Natural History in New York that was shot in 1896. But since that point, there have been no formal records of this species. And so because we included that we didn't come across the species in our paper describing what we found during our expedition, that came across the desk of John Mittermeier, who recently launched this Search for Lost Birds project through the American Bird Conservancy. So this project is meant to look for species that haven't been formally documented in 10 or more years. So formal documentation being unmistakable photographs or audio recordings of the species. And so naturally, because our bird hadn't been documented since 1896, that's quite a lost species. So he was very interested to work with us to go look for it. And so we started making a plan back in summer or spring of 2022 is when we started planning our search for this species. The first step was to get this guy, Doka Nason, on board, who now is a viral video sensation, which I'll get to at the end of my talk. So now millions and millions and millions of people know about Doka. But until recently, only a few of us who are lucky to have worked with him in the field understood how special this guy was, just as a person, but also as a biologist. So he and I have been working together since 2015. So much of my dissertation work was made possible because he has unparalleled levels of skill for conducting bird field studies. So he's constantly making bird lists. He knows every bird by sight and sound. And he'll often run out of pages in his notebook, and then he'll just start writing on his hand. In addition to that, his ability not only to detect and identify species, but for the ferry run work I was doing to just track a single individual that I was focused on for an experiment that I was doing I've never seen anyone able to do it like he does. And I've been lucky to work with dozens and dozens of really impressive people globally. And so Doka and I, both have a great professional relationship, but then he's also a dear friend. This is us after our expedition in 2019, feeling relieved that we were finally off this cloudy, rainy, cold mountain, and we were just tourists together looking at these geysers. And back in 2019, he also gave me the greatest honor of my career and even personal life to this point. He named his last-born son after me. So I was able to reconnect with little Jordan back in 2022 when we did this trip that I'm now going to start telling you about. Okay, no, I'm not going to start telling you about quite yet. So this is from 2022 from our trip. So now fast forward a few years from the trip I was just telling you about. This is Doka. I just wanted to give you guys a sense of how impressive he is. This is going to be a video of Doka climbing to a curl-crested monocode nest, that same bird of paradise I was telling you about before. So this species, despite being relatively common in these areas, no one had described the nest for this species before. And Doka found a nest on our trip. And despite it being up pretty high in this really skinny tree, he looked at it and he said, I'm going to put a camera on that nest. And I looked at him and said, well, I don't know how that's going to be possible. I don't think that's a great idea. And he said, no, I'm going to do it. So I handed him a trail camera and he climbed up one of the neighboring trees to put a camera on it. So I'll play this video. So you can see, not only is he adept at finding birds, but also at climbing. It's totally effortless for him. And then this is the video of the adult monocode visiting. So here in this video, once it jumps to a branch to the right, you'll see that those iridescent blue wings. So the nest is just above the bird there. You can see that glossy color to its wings there. All right, so that's just to give you an idea of the kind of things that Doka can unlock. But back to the search for this lost species. So we made this plan to go look for the species, and we knew that really the only chance that we had to find it, if it was still around, because there was a decent chance that it was extinct, but if it was still around, we knew that local people would know, and they would be the ideal partners to work with to try to document this species, and particularly hunters who are spending the vast majority of their time in the forest getting protein for their family. Those would be the people who would be most likely to know this bird, because it's going to be a ground-dwelling, relatively large species, about the size of a chicken. And so presumably, if it's still around, then it's probably an important protein resource, or had been in the past when it was more common. And so we designed this hunter interview protocol where we showed hunters illustrations of 25 different bird species, with the black-naped pheasant-pigeon illustration, which is in the middle of that photo, just mixed in. And some of the species that we chose cards for are known to be on Ferguson, most of them. Some of them we know are not on Ferguson Island, and some of them were species that could be, because we not only wanted to learn about the black-naped pheasant-pigeon, but because there's a decent chance that this bird had gone extinct, we wanted to have a chance of also finding some or proving that some species were on the island that weren't known to be there to science yet. And the way this protocol worked is, if someone picked a black-naped pheasant-pigeon illustration, but then they also picked a cassowary, which we know is not on Ferguson Island, then we might think, well, they're probably thinking about a different bird, or maybe their bird knowledge isn't very good. They're not the ideal partners for us to team up with to go into the forest and try to document this species that we're after. We also played vocalizations for 4 common Ferguson species, with a pheasant-pigeon recording from one of the mainland species mixed in, because we expect that it would sound similar to the mainland species. There are no recordings or photographs of this species because it hadn't been documented since the 1800s. So that was the closest we could get. For what it's worth, the way that pheasant pigeons are often detected on the mainland is by their calls. They have this really far carrying call. And so the best way to detect them is to walk a steep ridge where you have a chance of hearing them from a valley on either side of you as you're walking that ridge. That's the only way that I've heard one before. So for these interviews, we needed to have a really expert translator. And we were lucky that this guy, Eli Malesa, who we worked with in 2019, was willing to be our translator for this trip. So we just happened to cross paths with him in 2019. He was the one who helped us make this, relatively complicated plan to go up on this unexplored mountain with people in his village. And as it turns out, he is quite a gifted translator and is, really well connected and respected, both on Ferguson Island, but across a variety of islands, because he is one of the last remaining members of this historic shell trading ring that goes back centuries, if not thousands of years. So this has been a subject of a lot of anthropological studies. I'm not an expert on this shell trade ring, so I won't go into much detail here. But it's a ring where these shells are traded over the course of decades and sometimes even centuries. And each time they go around this ring of islands, they accumulate more value. And it's not exactly monetary value, it's more cultural value. And so Eli is one of the living traders in this ring. And so that means is that he has to speak a lot of different languages to be able to communicate with his partners around these islands. And be able to maintain these partnerships, which is not easy. So Papua New Guinea is the most linguistically diverse country in the world. It's over 800 languages in one small country. And so over the course of our trip, where we didn't really cover that much distance, we were just on one half of Ferguson Island, I think he translated our interviews into 5 different languages. So he is extremely impressive. We've talked after the trip, we had a really big team that all converged on looking for this lost species, that if there was one person that if they dropped out, we would have failed, it would be Eli. As impressive as Doka is, we had a lot of people who were good with birds. He's better than all of us. But Eli was the one who there's no way we could have done it without him. Okay, so again, here's a map of Ferguson Island. So we initially came to the area that we did our expedition in 2019, which is where Eli is from. And we struck out with finding people who knew the Black-naped Pheasant-pigeon. That's what BNPP stands for here. And not only did they not, pull the card for the Black-naped Pheasant-pigeon in the interviews, but by and large in these villages, the knowledge of birds was really impressive, which is what I would expect based on, the informal work that I had done in that space before, where I would just page through field guides with people. But now doing this more rigorous approach to that, we were able to, directly illustrate that the level of knowledge in these places is really remarkable. And so the fact that the knowledge was really good, but nobody knew this species, caused us to start to lose hope a little bit. At least I'll speak for myself. At this point, we were about 2 weeks in, having gone to these 3 villages, and it wasn't looking great because people knew their birds well and they didn't know this bird. However, we started to move a little bit further inland to more remote villages. And that's where we finally heard a story that seemed pretty credible about a black-naped pheasant-pigeon back in the 80s or 90s. The interview subject couldn't remember exactly when he came across this bird. But he said he used to come across them during this time period in this area that I've circled on the map. So there's this historic trail that people would often follow that weave through this mountain valley to a village on the other side of the mountains up here. And he told us that back when he used to follow this trail to go trade, he would hear or see this species. So that was exciting, but wasn't exactly what we were hoping for. And it was just one person. They went to a village even further inland, closer to this trail that the first guy was telling us about. And we heard basically the same story from a different person. So back in the 80s or 90s, they would follow this track where they would go and trade in a village on the other side of the mountains, and they would hear or see it in that area along the way. All right, so now we have 2 people. And then we went to another village, and we heard the same story again. And at this point, we started to get pretty excited about this area that we've circled on the map, that, given that people are consistently telling us the same story, it seems pretty credible. And in all 3 of these cases, These people hadn't been back to that area since the 90s. And so that told us that, maybe if we go there now, assuming that it hasn't been logged, the habitat hasn't been degraded, it could still be there. It would be nice to meet someone who's currently going to that area, but this is better than nothing. But it took, a really long time. For the sake of time, I cut out some of these videos, but I can show them to you another time. I will have them on my YouTube channel soon, but it's really hard to move around this island, at least for us. It's certainly a lot easier for local people who are a lot tougher than I am, certainly. But I've spent a lot of time backpacking with my free time. I love being out in nature and hiking up and down mountains. But, it was really rough terrain, and the New Guinea style of trail is not the American style of trail. So often we'd be following trails that, to me, if I were just trying to follow them on my own, I would get completely lost. And we're in dense vegetation and muddy slopes and really, really challenging conditions. So it took a lot of time just to move between these villages. And so at the time that we started to believe that this area was, could be supporting the black-naped pheasant-pigeon, we were already 3/4 of the way through our trip. There wasn't that much time left. In retrospect, we should have carved out way more time for this trip. But because we had so many partners converging on, trying to find this species, we were trying to pack everything into 1 month. So we decided with the last week that we had to make our way around the island by boat to this village that is where people would hike to when they would come across this species in the past. So this is the closest village to the area that we had circled on the map as far as we knew. So here's what it looks like to take a boat there. This is on a relatively calm day. I have done this trip where the seas are so rough you're worried about capsizing constantly. So this is one of the barriers to doing work in these places. And you're, of course, exposed to all of the elements on these boats. So we took one of these boats around the island and up a river to this village, and we started doing interviews that night. I was using my headlamp and a lantern, I think, to interview hunters right when we got there, because we didn't have much time left. And that night, we heard the first present-day black-naped pheasant-pigeon reports. And I should have said, actually, before getting here, that at this point, not only were we hearing the same story about where people had come across this bird, but they were consistently all referring to this bird as awo. That was the local name for the black-naped pheasant-pigeon. So the fact that they had one name for this bird that was unique from all the other birds that we would ask them about gave us some confidence that awo was a real bird that was around in the 80s or 90s. But it wasn't until we got to this village, which is the last village that we came to on our trip, that we found someone who had come across an awo about 8 months before we arrived, up in the mountains when he was planting a new garden. And so, oh yeah, before I get to that, so not only did we find someone who knew the bird from present day, but we talked to a lot of elders in this village who were telling us stories about the awo. So there was a local legend about how the awo came to be. And then there was a spell that men in the village used to use where they would summon the awo in this chant to try to attract a woman in the village who they wanted to marry. And so what this told us, given that there are these two different stories that we're hearing about this bird, is that it has some cultural significance in this area, which means that we've come to the right place. Clearly, at some point, this is probably a relatively common bird. And the fact that it is culturally important means that probably people will be interested to work with us to go try to find it and also to conserve this species. So I have a recording of what this spell sounded like. I think I'm going to have to go up in volume a little bit on the TV. I can't seem to control it from my computer. Maybe there's just a button on the, it might be fine for the people on Zoom. But for those of us in the room, okay. Oh, maybe I can, here, 1 second. Where is my cursor? So I think what I can do is maybe connect to the audio. Oh, my cursor is just not appearing at all. It's only on there, okay. Oh, it should be connected to that, okay. Give it a shot. Oh, now how do I get back? Sorry. No, I can't seem to find the talk on here because it's disappeared.
Yeah, so you have, this is essentially a second monitor, so.
Yeah, I should be able to get back over here, but it doesn't seem to be coming back.
Here's your mouse. Okay, now we're on this.
Now we're there. Okay, okay. Thank you. All right, apologies, everybody. Just want to make sure that everyone can hear this. All right, so it should be connected to the TV. So hopefully this works. Okay, great. Okay, so that was the sound of that that spell that was used to try to woo a female in the village. And he's referring to the bird as kakuo, which is an alternate name for this bird, awo. So often in this village, they'll add a K to the front of words. So we came to the right place finally. We know this bird has cultural significance here. There are legends about it, and people have seen it recently. And so at this point, we have about 5 days left, and most of our team goes and hikes up into the mountains with this hunter who claimed to have come across one 8 months prior to us, prior to our arrival. And Ellie and I go to do some more interviews in the last houses before this area that we had circled on the map. So we had heard some legends about the people who lived in this area, that they were really the most experienced hunters who were, going to this area that we were interested in, that we thought, might be sustaining this species. So most of our team goes up in the mountains and starts looking up there. Ellie and I go ahead to this other area. Ellie and I get there, and not only do we have present day pheasant pigeon reports, but we find one hunter who seems to know the bird really well. So he's gave us a lot of great natural history information about the species. We hadn't quite encountered that yet. It seemed like everyone else had just a pretty tenuous grasp of what this species was, and usually had just come across it once or twice or maybe 3 times. But this guy seemed to know it really well and encounter it most of the times that he would go into the forest. And he was really the only one who was actively hunting in this area that we had circled on the map. And the last house before that area that we had circled was from his older brother, who had not been hunting for a long time. But he also knew the pheasant pigeon really well. It has been a long time because he wasn't going to the forest anymore. And he was the primary landowner for this area that we had circled. And so at the end of our interviews, what we'd often do is show this poster where we would explain what brought us all the way from the US to these remote areas in New Guinea, where we'd tell them, this is the species that we really want to document. It's only known from Ferguson Island. We're worried that maybe it's gone extinct, or if it's still around, that it could go extinct pretty soon. And I could see as Ellie was explaining this in local language that his face started to contort and he looked really concerned. So after Ellie ran through the whole thing with him, he pulled me aside, Ellie did, and told me that this man had told him that he had recently leased over this land to a logging company. And he didn't know when they were going to arrive, but it could be any day. And that he didn't know that this was a particularly special species to people out there. To him, it was just another species that was on his land. It was news to him that this was only known from this one island, and that everyone who we had talked to up to this point, for the most part, had really pointed to this area of land that he owns as the place that harbors this species. And so, he really at this point wanted us to go into the forest and document this species and see if we could, work together to make an alternative arrangement that didn't involve, damaging habitat for this species. So this just added a lot of pressure to try to, prove that what local people were telling us was accurate. Because again, with searching for these lost species, it's not enough to say that, we heard that from people who seemed credible that this species was still around. We need to actually show that the species is still around. All right, so the difficulty was that, as you might expect, there's no cell phone service here. And so at this point, Ellie and I are convinced that we really need to bring our whole team into the forest in this particular area with the last 4 or 5 days we have left to go look for this species. But our friends had already gone up a different mountain with a man who had also claimed to have come across the species recently. Unfortunately, what they learned while they were walking around with him is that that was the only time he had ever seen that species. And so, he is a really impressive naturalist. His bird knowledge is really good. But we started to think that, well, probably where they went with him is not really the best place to go look with the little bit of time we have left. So Ellie and I had to hike back down to the main village, which is quite a process, and then hike up a mountain just to tell our friends, hey, you guys want to come back with us to this area that we think is going to be really good? And when we told them what we had learned in our interviews, they were really encouraged because, they had just spent a really tiring day going up and down this mountain and started to, doubt whether or not they would have a chance of finding it there. And so they were very supportive of this plan to go look for it in the area that we had circled at this point weeks prior on the map. All right, just to give you a sense of what it's like to walk along this trail. So this is part of this trail that's been used for, as far as we know, potentially centuries. It's almost like, this section like bouldering. So before I came here, I'm a member of a rock climbing gym that has an outfit in Rochester, which is just 5 minutes down the road. So I was doing some bouldering before coming here. So this was actually quite fun for me, but it can be pretty treacherous. And just to illustrate how difficult it can be, to move efficiently between places and what was involved when Ellie and I had to, hike back to find our friends. Oh yeah, this is a hunting dog. Yeah, that's Serena, who I've also been working with since 2015. Completely unfazed. And this is Ellie, our translator. He always would tell me that these things were dangerous. This is actually at the end of our trip when you can see just how many people were involved with helping us carry our gear, and we would always have a lot of guides along with us too, just to make sure that, we were being proper stewards of the land. So really, really beautiful, but challenging terrain. And so, I think I counted 12 river crossings just to go from the main village to these last houses. And then from there, we, headed up some pretty steep mountains, and then made our camp where we would spend, it was 3 or 4 nights, I'm already forgetting, but not as much time as what we would have liked. But when we got to this area, one thing that was encouraging is we started coming across these, some species like this orange-footed megapode, which are, well, this species really is the most similar species to the black-naped pheasant-pigeon in that it's mostly living on the ground. It's about the same size. This is the one species that every hunter said is the species that they hunt of bird. So we'd ask them to rank the species that they hunt in order of most commonly hunted to least commonly hunted, and everyone put this number one. So the fact that we were coming across a bunch of these orange-footed megapodes was a really good sign that we had come to a place where there's, not so much hunting and human disturbance generally. And so that made us feel good. So we had brought, at this point, just a handful of trail cameras for this last phase. We had left some in other locations to boost our chances of documenting this really elusive species. So these are motion-activated cameras, which a lot of you, I'm sure, already know. But we left, I think it's 5 different cameras in areas that our local guide, who is the same guy who seemed to know the awo, the black-naped pheasant-pigeon, really well, and areas that he thought would be good for it, including in one spot where he said that there were recent tracks for the awo. And I looked down, and I'm not an experienced wildlife tracker, but I've been doing this kind of work for a while, and I have some idea of what to look for, and I couldn't see anything. But he insisted that there are just some little leaves that had been displaced. And, we just totally put our faith in him that, all right, this guy seems to be the expert. We'll just put the cameras where he says, and fingers crossed. And this is him along the river. I'm not naming any of these individuals because part of our protocol for doing these kind of interviews, because it technically involves human subjects and involves not naming people in case that brings any risk to them. So that's why I'm not saying exactly who this is. But he, again, is a really impressive natural historian, knows the awo, the black-naped pheasant-pigeon, really well. So he was guiding us over the few days that we had in this forest. He's the only one really who knows this forest well. And so again, this is just to give you a sense of what this area looks like. And this is Doka carrying firewood. So Doka ended up carrying this firewood for, I think, about 8 hours, because it's so hard to find good firewood there, and we needed it to cook. Oh, I don't like that at all. And despite, I like rock climbing, I'm not that afraid of heights or these kind of dangers, but I was pretty sketched out by what we had to do around this waterfall. Ellie absolutely loved these pristine rivers. So whenever he came to them, he would, tell me just how perfect it was. Okay, so what we didn't know at the time was that river, so this is the second to last day of our expedition. That beautiful river, when I was taking those videos, despite the fact that at this point, it felt like we were probably going to fail on our mission. We only had a day and a half left. But that river was so beautiful that I got my GoPro out and I was filming it. And like, at least this place is so beautiful. And this was really a once in a lifetime adventure. Our mission has failed, but I can still appreciate how beautiful this is. What we didn't know was that river was not the river that we were camping along. And so our guide, who again is the only one who knows this area well, and New Guineans are renowned for their ability to navigate in forests like this. There are a lot of tales, if you've met birders who have gone into the forest with New Guinean bird guides, their ability to just somehow pick up on landmarks that to us are non-existent and track from where they've seen a bird back to the road it's unbelievable. But this area is really tough to navigate in because there are a lot of rivers with really steep sides, and all these ridges kind of look the same. The rivers kind of look the same. So when I was taking those videos, I was, enjoying being in this river, and thought that, okay, we're just going to follow our guide and we're going to hike along the river back to camp. We're going to have a small meal because at this point we're running out of food, because we had tried to hire a set number of guides and porters to help us, and we had enough food to feed them. However, because we're quite an attraction in these places, we're the first people who look like us there, naturally and understandably, people from those last houses before this remote area knew that we were going to go into the forest, and they wanted to be there with us to see what we were up to. And that is, of course, their right. They own the land, and so we weren't going to tell them that they can't come along. But what that meant is then instead of having a team of around 8 people, we had, I think it was 22 or 23 people in camp with us. And we wanted to make sure everyone was getting some food, as great as New Guineans are with, finding food in the bush oftentimes in these places. It felt pretty bad to have meals where it's just us eating and we're not sharing it. So we were really tightly rationing food, and yeah, it was rough. But we knew we only had a couple days in this area, and this is our last chance to document it. So anyway, all that is to say that we ended up getting lost in this river. Our guide left us because he was lost, and I think he was embarrassed that he was lost. And he just made a beeline for where he thought camp was. He found camp, came back and found us, and there'll be more videos on my YouTube channel about that soon. I don't want to take too much of your time here, so I've cut those out. This is us once we're confident that we are heading in the right direction to camp. Many hours later, again, we had tightly rationed food, so I'd had a single scoop of peanut butter this morning, and Ellie, as he'll say in this video, has had one biscuit, one little cracker, and that was it. And we had been hiking for 8 or 9 hours at this point in some pretty challenging terrain. So he found this palm shoot that is edible and actually ends up being pretty tasty. This is just to give you a sense of his personality and what it was like. We were trying to keep things light despite the fact that it felt like our mission had failed at this point. We didn't have much time left, and we had been lost for hours. We were feeling pretty beaten up at this point. Ellie is finding food in the bush. Ellie, what have you eaten today?
It's a palm like black palm.
Oh,
Sweet.
can I try some?
Yeah.
What did you eat? What have you eaten before this?
What do you say?
What have you eaten before this today?
Oh, I had a biscuit. Yeah, so I'm hungry.
A single biscuit.
Yeah.
It's not 1:30. All right, I'm gonna try it.
It's a little bit, not all of it.
Huh? Oh, it's pretty good.
Oh man, it's not ready.
Okay. It's pretty sweet.
Not ready, that's it.
Now we have the energy to get back to camp. Okay, so at this point, now we're heading back to camp. We have one afternoon and one morning left before we're going back. And so we're starting to make plans of how can we get funding to return and prove that this bird is here, because we really trust what these locals are telling us. And so I was kind of starting to make some plans with Doka, because he's from the neighboring part of the mainland. It would be relatively inexpensive for him to get there, and I was thinking of the funds that I could use from my small postdoc account that I could send to him to go back and set more trail cameras and try to prove that this bird is still there. We had totally given up, or at least I had totally given up. But the last thing that we had to do, this is now the last day of the trip, it's the day after we had gotten lost. Again, we're kind of on an empty stomach here, and Doka and I decided to, that we had the energy to go hike up to fetch the trail cameras that are on this ridge above camp before we hike out. So this is, an hour before we're leaving camp and starting the long journey of getting back to the US and giving up on this mission for now. I came to this trail camera and I sat down, I think mostly because I was just really tired and feeling, beaten up in a lot of ways. And I just started absentmindedly scrolling through the photos. And it was just photos of us setting up the trail camera, which is usually what you see. And then suddenly there was this photo that was just unmistakably Awo, the bird that we were looking for. So this is when I fortunately, I usually am not good about documenting the research that I do, but I knew that this was going to be, one heck of an adventure. And so I was really documenting every step, and I had my GoPro in my pocket, and I just instinctively started recording. There was no thought that went into it because I was, totally out of my mind because I couldn't believe what was happening. And I called Doka over, and this is a video now that has been seen by, it's been estimated to me, 60 million people, and that was before it just went viral again a few nights ago, just out of nowhere. It looks like a lot of that was actually in Thailand, so it'll just pick up. There'll be different countries that pick it up at different times. So it's gone viral 3 or 4 times now. Has been seen by a lot of folks, and hopefully you'll see why with Doka's reaction here. There's a lot of colorful language. I'll warn you.
Doka. It's owl. Isn't it owl? We can't tell them. We have to have them look through the photos too. We say nothing. Holy shit, man. Oh, man. What the fuck? Oh my god. Oh man, can you split back? Man, shit, my lips are shivering. I can't believe it. Dude, it's an owl.
So you can see him just go through all stages of, he was in disbelief initially and then just so excited and then relieved. I don't think he's ever failed at anything in his life. And this trip at this point had been a total failure. I mean, there's a lot that I'm cutting out of this for the sake of time, but there was a lot of drama on this trip and a lot of doubts and some internal conflict at times too, because we were spending a lot of time together, and it's bound to happen when it's, things aren't going as planned. But I'm forever grateful that it was, Doka and I who went to grab this camera together, because we have this history going back to 2015, and got to share this once in a lifetime moment together. So as Doka says in the video, it's the happiest moment ever, which I think is certainly for me, research-wise, is the case. I don't think I'll ever experience what that felt like. So just to be clear, there had been no photos of this species before, and so to see a photo of a bird for the first time that's never been photographed, that you thought was maybe extinct, especially when we really were convinced that the mission had failed and this was the last thing that we were doing. It's impossible to describe. So again, just to show you what the illustration looks like. So despite, as you can probably tell there, the LCD screen on the trail camera is really small. So sometimes people wonder, well, how do you know that it was that bird? There's just nothing else that looks like it. And look at how well it just matches the illustration that we had to work off of. So even though we didn't know what it looked like of this species, it matched the illustration so well. And I say in that video that we can't tell them, we have to let them, see the photo for themselves. That was the first thing that I thought of. I wanted to make sure, because this was such a once in a lifetime experience. And I've been a part of some trail camera findings before that were exciting, but not nearly as exciting as this, where I wasn't there for that moment where you realize, like, whoa, we have wolverines on our trail camera. So I wanted everyone else who was back at camp to have that experience. And so this is Jason, who was with me from the start in this project and is a huge part of why we embarked on this mission to begin with, experiencing the shock and excitement of seeing the trail camera image. And then, as it turns out, one of our other cameras at a location very far from here that we had left for a number of weeks picks up this video of the bird. So you can see why it's called a pheasant pigeon. So it kind of has the face of a pigeon. I often say, like, the derpy face of a pigeon. It has kind of that vacant look in its eyes that you see with pigeons. But it is niche-wise, it kind of fills the niche that a pheasant would, because there aren't any pheasants native to New Guinea. So these large ground-dwelling pigeons kind of fill that niche. They have these really strong, heavy legs, and they fan their tail up and down while they're walking. It's not known exactly why they do that, but I think the idea is that it might flush up some insects that they can eat. So somehow we also ended up with this video, and that was another shock. This was several days later, once we got back to town before we flew back to the US. We were going through our other trail cameras and couldn't believe that another one of our cameras picked up this bird. So just to give you a sense of the traction that's picked up on social media was none of us could have expected that. There's just millions and millions and millions of views. On TikTok, which I'm not on, so I didn't actually initially see this, but people started to send me videos that had millions of views there. And then on YouTube, which I now am on, and I'm slowly kind of releasing videos because my job, I'm currently teaching 2 courses at Cornell and still doing mostly my ferry run work. This is still a little bit of a side project, but one that I'm obviously very excited about. So I have so many videos from this trip that I'm starting to release. But this is just when I searched black-naped pheasant-pigeon on YouTube a year ago. So this doesn't even show all the recent videos. So picked up all over on social media. A lot of major news outlets picked it up. It's been translated to dozens of languages. The last thing, not to end on a negative note, but one thing I like to say to end this talk, because a lot of people have seen the news articles, and we're all very grateful that it kind of captured people's imaginations the way that it did. Unfortunately, we still have a long ways to go with how we talk about work in places like New Guinea and discoveries. So what I'm highlighting here is terminology in all of these articles, often in the headlines, that I feel a little bit squeamish about because of how we ended up documenting the species. So it is fair to say that this is a rediscovery, but we like to add to science to that, because for local people, this wasn't something that needed to be rediscovered. There aren't that many local people we found who knew this species was still around, but there were some, and that's how we ended up documenting this bird. There are a lot of articles that mention this is the first time it's been sighted, which is definitely not true, because there have been plenty of local people who have sighted it since the 1800s. And it's not to blame any of these individual journalists. It's just the nature of how this news comes out and how we think about places like New Guinea and who does the discovering. And it tends to be people who look like me. But the whole way that this project succeeded, the way this mission succeeded, is that we tapped into that really incredible local knowledge, specifically indigenous knowledge. And to circle back to what I said about that trail camera that delivered the first ever photos, that was a trail camera that I was talking about, where I looked down and I couldn't see any evidence that there was anything there. And in many ways, it seemed like kind of a crappy place to put a trail camera. The field of view was really narrow. It was on top of this steep ridge. But he said, when we set up that trail camera, he said, an owl walked through here that morning. So we set the trail camera, and then the next morning, an owl walked right past. And then the next morning, an owl walked right past. And then that afternoon is when we grabbed the trail camera. So he knew what he was talking about. And, he doesn't have the credentials to be called a scientist, in our culture, at least. So, that knowledge, unfortunately, has been kind of lost in a lot of these articles. For him, it's not a rediscovery. It's not something that hadn't been seen for a long time. He's been seeing it. He's probably the only one on the planet who's, really knows the natural history of that species really well. And so, specifically these folks who, are sort of lost in this story oftentimes, who, are the reason that we were able to prove that this bird was still around. So with that, a lot of people to acknowledge, these are just the folks who are, part of the core team, who are there for most of the trip, if not all of the trip. And, we really needed everybody. Like I said, we especially needed Ellie for his translating help, even though he wasn't a bird guy going into the trip at all. He had never paid attention to birds, but by the end, he was starting to identify things, and he was into it. And yeah, I can take any questions. This is the YouTube channel, just in case you're on YouTube and you want to see more There are some more videos on there now. It'll be slow for me to release more, but in case you want to follow along, I do have more to share from this trip, and we'll be going back in May and June, and we'll be taking more footage and hopefully learning more about this bird. All right. Well, I'm sure I went over time, so thanks for sticking with me and thanks for watching.
I just asked, nobody has asked me any questions yet.
What was the length of your trip there?
A month. Yeah.
And how much of that was in the trails?
Yeah, actually, a relatively small proportion of the time, because a lot of the time was in villages doing those interviews, because it took us so long to find the ideal partners for this. You know, we were initially, I think, relatively optimistic. Well, I say that, but I remember saying in a pre-interview before this trip, Jason and I both said we put our confidence at 30% that we would document this species, that it's still around, and that we'd have the chance to document it. Of course, that number is just made up. You know, there's no way to measure how likely it was. But that was the level of confidence that we had. But I thought there was a decent chance that we would pretty quickly find people who seemed to know the bird, and that we could just straight away go with them in the forest and spend a long time in the forest with them. But instead, the way it worked is we had to keep moving from village to village, trying to find someone who had seen it recently and seemed to know it well. It wasn't until the very end. So it ended up being more dramatic than we would have hoped in the moment, but it makes for a fun story now.
Has this been life-changing for you? I mean, you know, with all I mean, it's one thing to get a lot of likes and views online,
Yeah.
but has this like put you in a different echelon of researchers?
Not really. I wish my answer to that is yes, but no. No, it has been. It's definitely life-changing. I mean, that experience of, you know, that fortunately is captured now, which again, normally I wouldn't do. I'm not someone who documents, who's constantly filming or taking photos. So that moment that Doka and I shared is, you know, that is certainly life-changing. I'll never forget that. And it has informed, you know, some of the work that I'll be doing going forward. So it has been foundational in some ways. But as far as just what it means for me professionally, I mean, currently it hasn't changed that much. Yeah, but it's a great thing to be a part of. It's really a once in a lifetime thing in this field. Yeah, there has been a lot of media coverage, and of course, people are excited about it, and especially in the birding and ornithology community, it's a great thing to be able to talk about with people, having been a part of this. But yeah, academia is still a tough nut to crack, regardless of these kind of findings. Yeah.
Is this a normal way to proceed to find a bird lost to science? Is to find locals that know it?
Great question. So no, I think it's becoming normal. We're not the first to use a similar approach or this kind of approach for interviews. So we, you know, had read some papers that used an approach kind of like that, and then we, you know, tweaked and made some new components that would work well for this bird. I've seen there are papers certainly in mammals. I can think of a paper by actually a New Guinean who we're now going to work with, who's a professor in New Guinea, who's done something like this for a rare lizard species. I actually hadn't seen this in birds up to this point, but I could be missing it. I think that's one thing that we're really trying to make the case for. So we'll be, you know, we'll soon be publishing a paper kind of describing our methods and reporting this finding. Of course, the news is already out, but we need to, you know, get it in a scientific journal. And we're trying to make the case that, yeah, this is a really great way to approach this. What will have to be tested is, you know, how much do you have to tweak it for places that aren't New Guinea? So I think New Guinea, I think there are a lot of places where indigenous and local knowledge is really robust. In my experience of the places I worked, I haven't encountered a place like New Guinea. There's certainly other places out there like that, but I think New Guinea is probably toward the top of that list as far as just the immensity of local knowledge. You don't have to work that hard to find people who are like proper natural historians. So yeah, we're hoping that this will become more common. I think it will. I mean, there are certainly a lot more publications now talking about how underappreciated indigenous knowledge is for science and conservation. And so it's starting to take hold for sure.
So, with the indigenous people's knowledge, the title of the thing is about hunters, so this is a game bird.
Yeah.
You also said they knew a lot about the, songbirds and other less useful birds.
Yeah, yeah.
So are they birders, maybe not like us, but as a hobby sort of thing?
Yeah, I think just because they're there, and if you're spending a lot of time in the forest, which a lot of these people do, I mean, you just notice what's around. But yeah, there is definitely special attention paid to game birds. And so I think this particular method, I think it can work even for, people who just have, it could work for birders, I think, using a protocol like this. But I think it works especially well in places like this where you're looking for a species that presumably is a game bird. As it turns out, because I think there are so few of these left, we never found someone who commonly hunts them. Even that guy who knew them really well and seemed to come across them a lot, I think once he said his dogs had gotten one, and that's it. So maybe it was hunted once commonly, but certainly not in present day. And we would always ask for people who knew the bird if they hunted it, and then we'd ask, did your father hunt it? Did you hear any stories of this being, a commonly hunted bird in your village? And the answer to those questions was always no. So there's no record that this was ever a common game bird, which still is somewhat surprising to me because maybe it's just always been so pretty rare. It certainly fits the profile of bird that would be hunted very heavily.
Stories about importance.
Yeah.
And yet not
Yeah. Yeah, because any bird is fair game there. So even the sunbirds, which are like we call them the old world equivalent of hummingbirds. So they're in Asia and Australasia, the South Pacific, and they kind of fill the niche that the hummingbirds do here, where they feed on nectar. So they're really small, like this big. And we had a lot of people who told us that they hunt sunbirds. And what they do is they find the nest, and it's a domed nest, so it just has one little entrance, and they'll just creep up on the nest and put their hand in front of the entrance to the nest when the adult is in there, and it'll try to flush, and they'll grab it, and they'll cook it and have a snack. So yeah, anything could be on the menu, and it's really only the Goldie's bird of paradise that basically no one hunts. And it's because it's illegal to hunt, and there is, I think, some level of enforcement because it is important for ecotourism, and it's listed as a vulnerable species. So that's the only one where people would tell us, yes, we don't hunt it, and then we'd ask, well, why don't you hunt it? Like, well, it's illegal to hunt. In some cases, in the not too distant past, it was still hunted pretty commonly until it was illegal. Yeah. What's that? I did, yeah, I did in that on that initial trip in 2019. Though unfortunately, all of the males were in the process of dropping their tails. They were all molting somehow that time of year, which is a bummer. Just multiple times a male came by and like, yep, that he also doesn't have really what makes those birds of paradise special. I got some decent looks on our 2022 trip. They were constantly, you hear them almost always in the forest there. They're not that uncommon, but it is hard to get a good look just because of the nature of the where they hang out in the canopy. And the females were always around. They're easier to get a good look, but the males, I think because they have such elaborate plumage, you know, they're a little bit more cautious with their movements, and yeah, they're hard to see. Yeah.
Two questions. So first one is, what is the next step in your work for the species?
Yeah, so the plan is just to learn as much as we can about it, because at this point, really, all that we know is some anecdotal information from that hunter who seems to know them really well. And so what he told us is that May and June are the best times to detect them, because that's when this one tree species drops its fruits on the ground, and the owl will come around and feed on those fruits. And that's when he hears them vocalizing, and then shortly after that is when they nest, according to him. And so we're planning to go back in May and June, and hopefully work with him and try to learn more about the species, both to get some recordings of its call, which would be useful for detecting it in the future. And then we can, use automatic recording arrays to get a sense of how many birds might be around once we, know exactly what they sound like, and can, have algorithms detect them for us, which actually you'll hear about when Allie, I would think, when Allie presents at the next meeting, since she works for Merlin. But also to just try to figure out exactly where it remains on Ferguson. There are some reports that we've heard from a neighboring island that we're going to go to that could potentially have this species, even though it's never been described there. So we really just want to figure out which areas sustain them, how many might still be around, and then hopefully once we have boots on the ground, we can work with our local partners to figure out how to keep the bird around, which is a tough challenge. I could talk about this for hours. I'll just keep it short. It's difficult because we have to offset the economic benefit that would come from logging. And so we haven't found a way to do that yet. But it's something that we're going to work on with the government there once we're back in country. We've already had conversations about this, but this has to be driven. The conservation efforts, if they're going to occur, have to come from local people. And for that to happen in places where there aren't any opportunities for economic growth, we have to find a way to provide some economic benefits to make that happen.
The second question actually pertains to logging. First, Mary says, thanks so much for all that climbing and sharing this, for your approach and acknowledging the local experts. What about the logging company? Can they be fended off?
Yeah, that's a question I've gotten a lot. It's a good question, because it's still a cliffhanger, despite this news now being over a year old. Unfortunately, that's still a cliffhanger. I don't know if the logging company has arrived yet. Nobody knew when they were going to arrive, and because there isn't any cell phone service anywhere close to these areas, we haven't been able to keep in touch with our local partners. Ellie was our window into that world. For a little while, he was kind of going back and forth from where there's service to Ferguson. But he recently got married and moved back to Ferguson Island. And so I haven't heard from him for months, and he's my only way to maintain that connection to Ferguson. So I don't know. Last I heard from him, they hadn't arrived yet. And yeah, the good thing is that in my experience, both specifically in this place, but just working in a lot of villages in New Guinea, I'm often approached by people who want help with finding any way to benefit from their land besides logging and oil palm, which are usually the two ways in which they can economically benefit from the land. So I try not to come there with to implant those ideas in people, because it's up to them what they want to do with their land. It's not really my business as much as, of course, I would love for that area to be conserved. But as with this particular landowner, in so many cases, I'm approached by people who just, even without me saying anything, that's how they want to pursue things. It can be difficult to figure out those arrangements and get enough people to come visit and, hire guides and porters to, offset what could be gained economically from logging. So remains to be seen.
That's all the questions from Zoom.
All right.
Is there a critical number of birds that you have to have them to be able to survive?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't know. Yes, I'm sure there is a critical number. That's never been a focal point of my research, but for this is something we should learn for this particular species. Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head, but one thing that we have discussed on our team, which we wouldn't take a decision like this lightly, but is there could be a scenario where if we determine that there aren't enough birds around, enough awo on this island, that we could do a captive breeding program potentially. Other pheasant pigeons do quite well in captivity, and so that's one way to try to keep them around. But of course, that would be a big challenge, and would require the government to fully be on board, and then locals in these places to be on board with that too. Yeah, well, so the fairy wren, my dissertation work was at Washington State University, and then for the last 2 years I've been at Cornell. So this recent expedition was since I've been there. Yeah. How many what? Well, it's less about the number of people and just the number of like vehicles. It's multiple planes and then usually a big truck to get to the coast, where we then take a boat to the island, and then it's all on foot from there. So yeah, you do need a trusty captain, because boats go missing in that area every year. It can be pretty scary. So the video I had of the boat trip, that was on a pretty tranquil day. I unfortunately am someone who gets seasick despite spending a lot of time on boats for this work. So I've had some really rough days going back and forth from these places, because it's not a fun roller coaster.
I was just going to ask, I assume that once you had visual proof, that you were able to get funding to go back.
Yeah. There is some funding from Cornell, from a donor at the Lab of O. And then Jason got a grant through a conservation outfit as well. So that's what's going to fund our follow-up work with a species, but then also we're hoping to go on a trip to look for another lost species on another island. That's actually somewhat closely related to this bird. Also doesn't have any photos, and hasn't been formally documented for a while. So yeah, this hopefully is the start of some fun projects. Okay, thank you.
Daughter and grandchildren Tasmania.
Oh,
And I've
Yeah.
and I've seen these blue fairy wrens at camp.
Yes.